Elena had long forgotten what it meant to feel whole. The days passed not as chapters but as repetitions, a cycle of gray mornings and heavier nights. She carried grief like an invisible weight, pressing into her chest with every step she took across the lonely acres of her ranch. The land had once thrived under her husband's hands, rows of strong fences, full barns, laughter echoing between the walls as cattle lowed in the pastures. Now, 2 years after the accident that had taken him, the ranch reflected her soul, broken, hollow, weathered. The roof leaked every time it rained, the barn doors sagged on hinges, and fences collapsed like brittle bones. She tried to mend them, but grief had stolen her strength. Every hammer she raised felt like a memory striking back at her. She told herself she would fix everything tomorrow, but tomorrow always came like a thief, leaving her weaker, not stronger. She lived on the edge of survival, more ghost than woman, convincing herself that loneliness was her destiny. It was in the dying light of one of those evenings, when the sky blazed orange and purple over the fields, that she first saw Daniel. He came walking down the dirt road, boots coated in dust, his stride unhurried but purposeful. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with storm-gray eyes that carried their own kind of weight. He looked like someone carved out of hardships, someone who had walked through more than one kind of fire and had learned to survive it. "You need help around here?" he asked, his voice low but steady, carrying no pity, only the kind of plain truth that caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to say no. She had become used to refusing kindness, used to keeping her walls high. But something about the way he asked, without force or intrusion, made her chest tighten. "Yes," she heard herself say, almost reluctantly. "I could use help." And just like that, Daniel became part of her days. He patched fences, hauled hay, hammered nails into wood that had long given up. He didn't ask her questions about her husband, didn't pry into her silences. He simply worked, his presence filling the spaces that had once ached with emptiness. Elena found herself watching him from the porch sometimes, the way his arms moved steady and sure, the way he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. There was no rush in him, no hurry, just consistency, as though he knew healing was built the same way as fences, plank by plank, nail by nail. Still, the grief inside her resisted. Every time Daniel told her to try, to lift something heavier, to step a little further, she bristled. "Push harder, Elena," he would say, his tone calm but firm. She hated the words at first. Push harder. Didn't he understand she had nothing left to push with? That every day was already a battle. But there was no judgment in his voice, only belief that she was capable of more than she allowed herself to be. One evening, the ranch bathed in starlight, she finally asked him, "Why do you keep telling me that? Don't you see I'm tired?" Her voice cracked, her frustration spilling like a wound reopened. Daniel set down the lantern he was fixing and leaned back, his eyes steady on hers. His mouth curved into a teasing smile, the kind meant to soften a heavy truth. "Because, Angel," he said, and the words sent a strange shiver through her, "I'll push right alongside you. I'll push until you scream louder than midnight fire, and realize you're still alive." Alive. The word echoed inside her. It was as though no one had spoken it to her in years. For so long she had been surviving, dragging her body through the days as though life had ended the moment her husband's heart had stopped. But alive, that was different. Alive meant more than existing. Alive meant feeling, breathing, laughing. She wasn't sure she remembered how to do any of those things. The first time Daniel's hand brushed hers as he passed her a hammer, she jerked back as though burned. Guilt surged, hot and suffocating. How could she let another man's hand touch hers when the memory of her husband's hand still lingered everywhere? That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies to the empty room. She thought Daniel hadn't noticed her pulling away, but the next morning she found a folded note on the kitchen table. "It's okay to love the memory of one man and the heartbeat of another. Don't fight it, just breathe." Her fingers trembled as she held the paper. Her tears fell so heavily they smudged the ink. Something deep inside her shifted, not healed, not fully, but softened, like frozen earth beginning to thaw in spring. Days passed, and little by little, pieces of herself returned. She laughed once when Daniel slipped in the mud and cursed the earth like it had done him personal harm. She laughed again when he sang loudly and terribly while fixing the fence, off-key but shameless. Each laugh startled her, like hearing a forgotten song. Each one reminded her that maybe she wasn't lost forever. But grief has a way of testing those who dare to rise. The storm came in the heart of summer, fierce and merciless. Winds howled through the valley, rain tore at the land, and lightning cracked open the sky. The roof Daniel had mended tore apart under the fury, cattle scattered, and Elena felt the old terror rise up inside her chest. The storm wasn't just wind and rain, it was every memory of loss, every scream she'd swallowed. She collapsed to her knees in the mud, the thunder roaring in her ears as she clutched broken boards in trembling hands. "I can't do this again," she screamed into the chaos. "I can't lose everything again." Through the sheets of rain, Daniel came running. His shirt clung to his body, his hair plastered against his face, but his eyes blazed brighter than the lightning. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, forcing her to look at him. "Yes, you can," he shouted. His voice was fierce, urgent. "Push harder, Elena. Don't let this storm take you like grief did. Stand with me, fight with me." Something inside her cracked wide open. Through the fear and the grief, through the storm's fury, she heard his voice, not just commanding, but believing. She rose, screaming into the wind, her voice raw, primal, wild. It was not just fear spilling out of her, it was life. It was fire. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her chest loosen, replaced with something fierce and burning. Together they worked through the night, driving the cattle back, tying broken doors, holding lanterns against the dark. And when dawn came, soft and golden, the ranch stood battered but unbroken. So did Elena. She stood covered in mud, drenched in rain, chest heaving, but she was upright. Alive, and somewhere deep inside, a fire had been lit that no storm could put out again. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained in the earth and in Elena's bones. When the first light of dawn broke through the torn clouds, the ranch looked battered but alive, like a body covered in scars yet still breathing. The fences lay in splintered lines, the barn roof sagged on one side, and puddles turned the ground into a mirror of the sky. She stood barefoot in the mud, her clothes plastered against her skin, her hair dripping rainwater, her chest heaving as if she had been reborn. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a ghost clinging to the remnants of a life that had already left her. She felt her heartbeat, raw and strong, and she realized with trembling awe that she had not broken, she had endured. Daniel was beside her, his hands on his knees, his breath heavy but steady. He looked at her not with pity, not even with pride, but with something deeper, recognition. As if he knew what it meant to come face to face with storms, both within and without, and to rise anyway. When she met his eyes, she saw more than a man who had worked her land, she saw someone carrying his own ghosts, his own storms, hidden behind those steel-gray irises. The days that followed were quieter but heavier in a different way. There was rebuilding to do, wood to cut, posts to set, shingles to hammer. But Elena noticed Daniel moving more slowly when the evenings drew near, as if the fading light reminded him of something he couldn't quite escape. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just the weariness of work. But the silence between them changed. It was no longer only comfort, it was also distance, something unspoken lingering in the air. One evening, while the sun melted into the horizon and the cattle grazed lazily as if no storm had ever touched them, Elena found herself watching Daniel instead of the sky. His face was turned toward the west, his jaw clenched, his shoulders heavy in a way that no amount of labor could explain. She set down the rope she had been coiling and asked softly, "What are you running from?" The question hung in the air like thunder. Daniel froze, his hands tightening around the post he had been leaning on. For a long moment, she thought he would walk away, or deflect with one of his half-smiles. Instead, his voice came low and uneven, as if pulled from a place he rarely dared to touch. "War," he said finally. "Like your husband. But I came back." The words cut into her chest. She had expected some wound, yes, but not one that mirrored her own so closely. Daniel's eyes flickered toward hers, and for the first time, she saw them wet with unshed tears. His voice broke as he added, "I never forgave myself for surviving when better men didn't." Elena's breath caught. She wanted to speak, but the weight of his confession pressed silence onto her lips. She understood suddenly why he had always told her to push harder, why he had fought for her to stand when the storm tried to break her, because he himself was still fighting, still pushing against the guilt that threatened to crush him. He had carried his survival not as a gift, but as a burden. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as it reached for his. At first he pulled back, but she held firm, her touch gentle but unyielding. "Maybe," she whispered, "that's why we found each other. Not to heal alone, but to heal together. Daniel's face twisted as if her words cut and soothed all at once. His shoulders shook, his voice ragged when he said, "Angel, if I give you what's left of me, you'll see it isn't much." Tears burned Elena's eyes, but she smiled through them, her voice steady with a truth she hadn't known she carried. "I don't need much, I just need you to push with me. One day at a time." Something inside him broke then, not into pieces, but into release. He lowered his head, his forehead pressing against hers, their breaths mingling, heavy and trembling, two wounded hearts learning the same rhythm. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to be seen not as the strong hand, not as the savior, but as a man who was just as broken as she was. And for the first time, Elena did not feel guilty for loving again. She felt grateful, for the memory of the man she had lost, and for the heartbeat of the man standing before her. The seasons rolled forward, together they rebuilt. The ranch that had once been silent began to breathe again. Elena found herself rising before dawn, her hands steady as she worked beside Daniel. Planting posts, painting wood, mending soil. Each act was not just labor, it was reclamation. Every nail hammered into the barn roof stitched another piece of her back together. Every fence that stood upright echoed the strength of her own spine. And Daniel was there for every step, his presence not overshadowing her but standing with her, side by side. Her laughter returned slowly, like spring flowers peeking through frost. At first, it startled her, the sound foreign in her own ears. But Daniel's face lit up every time he heard it, as if her laughter alone was enough to quiet the storms still raging inside him. And in time, she noticed his own laughter too, rough but real, echoing across the fields like something the valley itself had been starving for. The neighbors began to whisper, not in pity this time, but in wonder. Old ranchers passing by would shake their heads with small smiles, saying, "That girl's fire came back. Didn't think I'd see it again." Elena overheard once, and instead of flinching, she let it warm her chest. Her fire hadn't come back, it had been lit anew. On a warm summer evening, with the stars burning bright above them, Daniel finally broke the silence that had been waiting for months. They were sitting on the porch, their shoulders brushing, the air humming with the songs of crickets. His hand found hers, not hesitant this time, but firm. His voice came low, shaking but steady enough to hold truth. "Elena, I can't promise you forever. I've already learned life doesn't work that way. But I can promise you this, I'll push harder every day to love you more than yesterday." Elena turned to him, her eyes burning with tears that did not sting but soothed. She leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper, yet strong enough to be heard by the night itself. "Then we'll scream together, louder than midnight fire, until the world knows we lived." Their laughter rose then, tangled with tears, rising into the dark sky like a vow that even storms could not silence. And in that moment, under the burning stars, they were not just two broken souls clinging to survival. They were alive, alive in a way that roared, alive in a way that promised tomorrow could hold more than sorrow. Because some loves do not whisper. Some loves burn, untamed, fierce, louder than the storms that try to break them. Theirs burned that night, wild and undeniable, echoing across the valley like a fire that would never go out.